Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations at the Lab, hosted by Globo's Innovation and Experience Lab. In this series, we connect with language and cultural experts to consider how we communicate and why it matters. I'm your host, Francesca Mayer. Let's start the conversation. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Giulia Togato, Associate Professor of Psycholinguistics at California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Togato's interdisciplinary research merges the fields of cognitive psychology and translation studies. She started the Cohabit PsyLing Lab, hosted by RGRLL Department at the CSULB, where she investigates the interaction between cognition, professional translation, and bilingualism. I am grateful for her thoughtful and research-backed approach to the intersection of how and why of interpreting and translation. Dr. Togato, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you for having me today, above all.
Of course, I'm so excited to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks.
Thank you. Me too. Thank you.
Okay, so our first question is, which we ask many of the people that come on, is how did you get where you are now? There are so many different kinds of roles and careers that intersect with linguistics, language, the way that we do conversation, the way that we communicate. How did you end up in this role? And did you always want to study psycholinguistics?
Okay, so that's a very nice question. I'll tell you, my journey began, with a fascination for communication itself. So, I was literally fascinated by the power of communication to connect people, above all, across different languages and cultures. So at the beginning, I got a BA and MA in translation and interpreting. Actually, I teach translation, interpreting, and psycholinguistics, although, my research is mainly in psycholinguistics applied to translation and interpreting. And, so I got my BA and my MA in translation and interpreting, but as I got the chance to delve deeper into my curiosity, I really realized that I wanted to understand how people process and use language. So what I did is that I switched the emphasis on the human component, especially across multiple languages and cultures, because to me, switching the emphasis towards the brain, the human processing of languages, was essential to solve many real world challenges in communication. So starting from there, that realization drew me to an MA and then a PhD in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience with a specialization in psycholinguistics. And that's how I ended in this fascinating field.
It's interesting to see the connection, like as you talk about your experience with translation and interpreting and the psycholinguistics piece. I think that's unique. I don't know that I've heard about a lot of people doing that. So I think that's exciting that you're studying the connection between those things.
Oh, thank you. Curiosity can really open very different doors. So you might, start with something and then end up doing something different, but useful to understand what you started.
That's great. Which I'm betting has something to do with the Cohabit PsyLing Lab. So you founded this lab. Tell us a little bit about the work that the Cohabit PsyLing Lab is doing.
Yes. So I'll tell you, the Cohabit PsyLing Lab, it's really a vibrant space and above all an interdisciplinary space. I like to stress that word a lot, interdisciplinary. And there, what we do, we explore how the mind and emotions interact with language. My research and the research of my team focuses on mostly the comparison between different type of bilinguals. So untrained bilinguals, people who never received any training in translation and interpreting, but do speak two languages. And so we compare that group with professionals. So professional translators and interpreters, so people who are extensively trained in translation and interpreting. Now, a key element of our work at the Cohabit PsyLing Lab is not just interdisciplinarity, but also cross-sectors collaborations. In fact, we engage with language service providers, with neuroscientists, with VR and AI developers, and of course, with translators and interpreters themselves. And all these people, all these cross-sector collaborations allow us to approach our research questions in a way that has practical relevance, which is one of the main goals of my research. I really need my research questions to be useful for society. One of our main goals there is to apply psycholinguistic insights to improve communication and accessibility. And you know a lot about that at Global. For groups who really need to rely on translation and interpreting services, above all in contexts in which the fact that we take into account the psychological and social dimension of multilingualism is vital. So I'm thinking about translation and interpreting across languages in situations in which that translation or interpretation is life-changing. So think about the healthcare sector or public services, for example.
Super interesting, very important work. I think also when it is really important, and a lot of the part of what Globo looks at is we're always looking for research to be able to justify, okay, is the work that we're doing, does it matter? To what extent does it matter? And so the other thing that I came across as I was looking across all of your research and the things that are available about you, is that your research includes cognitive and emotional aspects of language processing in translation and bilingualism, which you started to speak to. And so one of the things that we think about a lot at Globo is that the ultimate goal of language access is understanding. It's not just about, hey, how well did you follow protocol? Even though a lot of what the industry looks like right now is about putting into place protocol and role adherence, making sure that you're staying inside of mostly the conduit role, for example, as an interpreter. But that's not the goal. The ultimate goal is understanding for, in healthcare, the patient, in government services, the person. And so I'm curious, can you share what you've learned about what makes people most likely to understand and process information most effectively across languages? Does it differ if you're using a second language? Like, have you seen that there's a difference there?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, well, we all know that, understanding across different languages can be especially challenging, not just because of the language itself, but because of cultural factors, because of contextual factors, because of situations of stress. So whatever that can, come into play in the communicative context. Now, overall, in your second language, being a bilingual, individuals often process information more slowly due to less familiarity with the grammar, with the vocabulary, and idiomatic expression. So the linguistic cultural factor. And there are more factors involved in this, let's say, more difficult understanding in the second language. So, for example, processing in your L2, in your second language, typically requires more working memory resources because you're decoding linguistic input, and that process will compete with the understanding of the contents. Misinterpretation of culturally specific elements, such as idiomatic forms, for example, is more common in the second language. And then we have another factor which is also extremely important in the second language. Usually people lacks, or it's less developed, the emotional depth that we usually have in our first language. And that can affect things such as the interpretation of the tone of the conversation, humor, and connotations, subtle connotation in conversation. Now, what is interesting when we talk about understanding, at least to me, is not just what people do differently in their second language, but the study of the coping mechanisms and the metacognitive strategies that learners develop to cope with all these issues and problems. That's why I got interested in psycholinguistics and cognitive science that much. You might want to have a look at things such as how people rely more on guessing from context, for example, to improve their understanding or translating mentally. So, referencing back to their first language in order to fill gaps in understanding, right? Now, in all this cognitive scenario, to me, the emotional framing is extremely important and also matters when we talk about mutual understanding. The questions that I'm trying to approach to get a better sense of how understanding and mutual understanding works are focused on emotions. So, for example, do we perceive emotions the same way in our first and second language? And how is that reflected in language processing? These are, to me, this is a fundamental research question right now. And these are the types of questions that we're currently asking at the Cohabit PsyLing Lab.
Super interesting. It also kind of makes me think about, so I just had a conversation this morning with our head of training and provost of Globo University is her title. Her name is Beck, and she's an ASL interpreter by trade. She was an ASL interpreter for years and years and got into interpreter training from there. And so she was telling me about when she's currently working on her pro-tactile interpreting skills, which I didn't even really know was a thing. But the idea is that for ASL interpreters who are interpreting for someone who is deaf-blind or has some other visual impairment, in certain situations, they need more information than just what a tactile interpreter can tell you. So like the idea is in tactile interpreting, you're signing into someone's hand, and that's the main conversation, main information that they're getting out of the conversation. But then if they're, for example, having a conversation like we're having in front of a large group of people, so maybe they're being interviewed or something, and so the interviewer would be, what they're asking would be signed into their hand in traditional tactile interpreting. But if someone walks in and whispers into someone's ear, that would be protactile interpreted. So on the back or on the arm, there's a separate protactile interpreter who's giving extra environmental information to the deafblind participant, which I knew that was a thing, but I hadn't really heard it explained that way before. And it raises so many questions about, like, to what degree are we filtering information as we're interpreting, or even like, because if you think about all of the different pieces of information that you have available to you as a seeing person, it's kind of a different use case, but it's kind of similar as someone who's using their first language and understands all of the different nuances of how a person is talking, and maybe understands a reference to a cultural touchstone, understands all the idioms. Like if you interpret that into a second language, you're filtering out some of those things. So yeah, just lots of questions, not any real answers. But I didn't include this in my questions. Do you have thoughts on protactile interpreting? Does that touch in your research at all, or no?
No, for now, but honestly, it sounds so interesting that I should, dig deeper into it
Super.
because it has a lot to do with all this contextual richness that we process as human being, and also it has a lot to do with the psychological and social dimension of the interpreter,
Yep, that's true.
which is an aspect that it will always be there, and we should take into account as much as we can. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting. So we'll talk more about that sometime soon, maybe. What is the most surprising thing that you found in conducting this research? What was like, oh my word, never would have thought of that.
Oh yeah. So I very recently I got a pretty surprise, a surprising discovery in one of the studies that I'm conducting right now. So what I found is that when, as bilinguals individuals, when we're given the same linguistic materials, it turns out we process them not just more positively in our first language, but also more negatively in the second language. Yes. So, this supports the idea that bilinguals might organize the emotional space differently in their first versus second language. And to me, this is, a huge piece of evidence that underscores how language is tied not just to cognition, but also, and possibly above all, to emotional perception. So right now, this is the finding that literally surprises me. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I would have thought, I think I would have thought your second language would be more distant from you
Mhm.
emotionally, like that you would be, there would be more of an emotional barrier when using your second language because it's not the one, you've heard people use the term your heart language. Like, I think there's like the kind of preconception that like whatever you're using as your first language is the one that's you identify most with. And so your second language, your third language, any other languages might be more distant from you emotionally, but
Detached?
yeah, detached. But it's surprising that it is actually just more negative.
Yes. So that's exactly the reason why I was so surprised.
Mm,
And I was a kind, oh my God, what's happening here?
mhm.
So that's a line of research that I'm going to, continue investigating and, creating experiments because usually the pattern that you get in the literature and the most straightforward hypothesis will be what you just mentioned, Francesca. So a detachment in the second language. But in that study, what I found it's a little bit different. I found just a more negative perception in the second language that it implies that there is still emotionality put in motion, right? But possibly the way we put emotion, that emotionality might be different across the two languages. So that's worth exploring more because the common belief is that detachment in the second language. Now, what I found is slightly different, and I think it's worth exploring. It can tell us a lot about how we align emotions in the first and second language, how we organize our emotional space in the first versus second language. So I'm working on it.
So cool. Also, I wonder if there is a connection between your level of detachment and the actual emotions themselves. Like the more detached you are, I wonder if there's a connection to like boredom or disinterest, or those are kind of negative.
Possibly negativity too, right?
Yeah.
Because of detachment, it can be. So now there is a lot of work to do on that initial data. So it will be a huge line of research that I will have there, and that hopefully, I will be able to shed some more light on all these questions.
So interesting. It also has me thinking about the use cases that we support at Globo and how, we do a lot of work, especially in healthcare environments. 80% of our business is healthcare, and that's where the majority of the need is for highly qualified interpreters, because that's where you can't afford for things to go wrong. And it matters that you have a human interpreting, not just from a compliance perspective, but all other kinds of reasons, including quality, but then also including things like if you're having a really hard conversation with somebody, the idea is, hey, if a person is interpreting that, it's probably going to go over a little bit better, or at least be more transparent about kind of what's going on, more empathic. I am thinking about a lot of the work that we do centers around, okay, how do we support this interaction so that there's understanding? And some of that is even like translating discharge instructions. It might not be the person in the moment, and I'm wondering, I mean, I might have to think about this a little bit, but I'm wondering to what extent even hearing it in your second language first, if you are on the spectrum of limited English proficiency and maybe you've had a scheduling conversation in English, then you get back to your doctor and you're talking about your heart condition, and that's when you need an interpreter. You've requested an interpreter because it's too technical, you don't understand the English anymore, but you're still hearing the English, and then it's being interpreted into your second language. I wonder to what extent that has a bearing versus like just seeing a piece of discharge instructions that have been translated. Like you don't know what the English said. Um, I'm curious about all of that now. So We'll have
Oh,
to
me too now.
Mhm.
Yes, me too.
We'll have
That's
to
worth,
talk
of
more.
course, that would be something worth exploring.
Mhm. All
Yes,
right, good deal.
that's a great idea, actually, Francesca.
Coming up with some new studies here.
Happy to hear
Um,
that.
so next up, we talked about your most surprising thing that you've learned. What was your biggest challenge? Or, oh, I'm sorry, no, what do you think is the biggest challenge based on your research in pursuing understanding? So as we center understanding in the conversation, as we're pursuing understanding, the biggest thing that stands in the way of someone understanding in their second language.
Okay, so to me, the biggest challenge, I mean, there are many, okay, but the biggest one is try to find a balance between accuracy and accessibility. What I mean is that the key in pursuing understanding is finding that sweet spot between, a situation in which the meaning is preserved without overloading the listener or the reader, both from the cognitive and the emotional point of view. So we want to avoid that overload and that pressure put on the listener, for example, in the case of interpreting. So Kahneman, which is a very well-known behavioral psychologist, made the point that work on cognitive ease supports, this idea. So when information studies are very complex, but if we had to summarize in one sentence, when the information it's easier to process, it's more likely to be understood and retained. That's a piece of information that might be extremely useful, for example, in interpreting tasks. So, and that's linked. So that's why, I'm making this point using Kahneman studies. That's linked to what I was mentioning about finding a sweet spot and a balance between accuracy and accessibility. And that's also linked to the idea that there is a lot of emotions and emotional mechanisms underlying the context of interpreting. So we want to make sure that accessibility is offered to the clients through this avoidance of overloading them emotionally and cognitively. So to me, that's one of the biggest challenges in understanding, above all in interpreting contexts.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a good point. It also makes me think about like different languages have different information density and different information density in different topics. So like an example is, I don't remember the name of the language, but it's more than one language that does this, but it's very rare that they do. But it's instead of using left and right, a language could use north, south, east, and west only. So move that cup south, southwest of you, or like, could you pass the sugar west? Which is very different than how English speakers or most other language speakers think. They would think, hey, pass it directionally to my left, not to the east. So if you're interpreting across two languages that use that very differently, oh my goodness, the cognitive burden of being like, wait a second, where is north? If I'm like, I never know where north is. So you are as an interpreter keeping both, hey, the left and right of how I'm oriented and the north, south, east, west in your mind at all times in order to do both of those things. And if you were to interpret into a language that had both, like, hey, maybe traditionally we're using like south, southwest, but if someone says left, there's a word for that. Now I have a choice to make about, if someone says left, do I use the less common left because that's the same thing as what they said in English? Or would I do the work inside my brain to interpret for them where that would be south, southwest or whatever? Super interesting. I don't
For
know.
an interpreter, it's a huge task. I mean,
Mhm.
when there is such a cultural distance between the two languages that you are forced to keep in your working memory at hand all that information, because different languages different, when they're so different that there is a huge cultural distance that has to do with how people organize space and time and move themselves into space and time. Now, for the interpreter, cognitively, that's a task. That's a huge task. And for the clients, of course, I think that connected to what I just mentioned about Kahneman's idea, we want to make sure as interpreters that we are avoiding that overload that, of course, we have to handle, right? But we want to make sure that our clients, so the people we work for, can have accessibility and balance, yeah, between having the information and not feeling overwhelmed from the cognitive or emotional point of view. Yeah.
I love that. I also think it highlights a lot of like there's a cognitive dissonance, or like there's more nuance, I think, than we like to give it credit for when we talk about the conduit role in interpreting. Like in theory, you're supposed to be in the conduit role the vast majority of the time, giving information back and forth. The next step is clarifier, excuse me, provider. I didn't understand that last thing, or that's not a word in this language, or whatever. Cultural broker is even less. And then at the very last, almost never advocate, only in the most extreme circumstances, in like a medical context. So, but when we talk about that, I think we do a disservice to the nature of languages, because conduit, even in being just strictly a conduit, staying in that conduit role, there's so many different choices for what does it actually mean to do meaning for meaning in any one case. So I think there's more nuance than we give it credit for, and giving a sense of, hey, yes, accuracy to the original message, and then also that balance that you spoke about. There's more room for that inside of being a conduit than I think that we always give credit for. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to switch focuses a little bit back to you and your work and why you do what you do. Why do you continue to do this? This is hard work. Why does this matter to you?
Yes, that's a great question. And one I love to answer. So to me, language is the foundation of connection. And, at the end of the day, it's the way we share ideas, emotions, who we are, our dreams. So that's a huge tool we have. That's a vital tool we have to share and to create society, right? And in a world that nowadays is increasingly connected and dependent on effective communication, the fact that we can ensure that language is a bridge is deeply meaningful to me. Mm-hmm. So every project, whether it's about improving translation technologies or understanding how the brain of bilinguals, translators, and interpreters work, feels to me like a step towards a more inclusive and connected world. And if I can somehow contribute even a little bit to create a more inclusive and empathetic linguistic policies that serve the people and take into account, as I was mentioning before, the cognitive and emotional dimension of language, just for that reason, that's a mission worth dedicating my life to. So that's I would say the only reason why I continue to do what I do. I literally have a passion for it. It's like, I would say the word is vocational. Mm-hmm. So I just, go to work, and when I'm doing this, it's like I'm not working. Mm-hmm. It just feels like, doing what I like. And I think that's fundamental. And honestly, it really makes you feel like you did the right choice. You're on the right path. And if you can help other people on the way, that's great.
It's a calling for you.
Oh, thank you.
You spoke to this a little bit in your answer. What do we gain from having different languages? If everyone spoke one language, what would we lose?
Yeah, actually, I think that connected to what I was mentioning earlier, we will lose a lot. Diversity in languages reflects diversity in thought, and that's the main reason why we will lose a lot. It reflects diversity in creativity and different ways that we have to approach human curiosity and expression. Mm. So, each language carries unique cultural values, unique views of the world, and unique ways of organizing reality. Language, we can say that it literally shapes thoughts and thought processes. As you mentioned earlier, from how we perceive time to how we perceive space, and we interpret movements in the space. So if we lost that diversity, we lose not only the richness of human communication, but also new and innovative perspectives on problem solving, for example. So to me, multilingualism really fosters empathy and adaptability, flexibilities in thought. And those are qualities that the world nowadays, above all, really need to keep. And it's not just about what we say, but how we think. That's why we really need languages, and we really need to learn languages so we can learn new perspectives and new problem-solving strategies, and we can learn to cope in different contexts and with different people. And different languages really allows us to think in beautiful, diverse ways. So to me, if we miss that, and if we miss language learning, and if we miss that empathy and communication across cultures, we're losing at the end of the day our essence as human communicating beings, right?
Absolutely. That was beautifully said. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
I am totally with you. I think, and this is coming, I am not a linguist, far from it. I took a lot of Spanish in high school, but I value so much even just hearing the examples of linguists across a bunch of different languages. Even just knowing that, like now I know that the concept of foster care doesn't exist in Spanish, because in Spanish-speaking countries, they don't have foster care. Even just thinking about that helps me to reframe, like, oh yeah, the concept of foster care is not, that's a cultural concept. And there are things even less cultural than that that don't exist in other languages, or would be totally different in other languages. That helps me to reframe and examine kind of daily life. And so absolutely we need different languages. And so I'm with you. Thank you for sharing.
We need them. We literally need them. And I'll tell you, the more, the better.
I totally agree. Yes.
That's connected to the topic of endangered languages and how important it is to act on that issue that we have, and avoid losing as many languages as we have, and preserving those languages and preserving those cultures. That's fundamental.
Absolutely. And creating space for new languages and cultures also. I mean, there's always, in concert with preserving old languages, or not old, but languages that are becoming less frequently spoken, there's also the idea of, hey, language is evolving, and what do we do with language that's becoming new? What do we do with slang? What do we do with TikTok jargon? And I think there's also a sense of like, that matters too. The way that we are evolving to speak in the future, like that, it's easy to kind of look down your nose at, hey, that's not proper language. But that's how languages are made. That's how we speak the English that we speak right now. It's the way that it happened in the past.
Exactly. And it tells you that a language is alive, is not bad. The fact that it evolves and it becomes richer and diverse and different, it means that language is alive. It has a soul.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So good.
Oh, thank you.
It's
so happy to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, this is so fun. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
I think I have two final questions for you, and they are doozies. Well, one is a doozy. I'll start with, can you tell us about a time your assumptions were challenged? What strategies do you use to kind of deal with assumptions being different? staying humble and curious and open, which I know is something that matters a lot to you.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you this story of when I was doing my PhD
Mm-hmm.
about, a time when my assumptions were challenged. So I was doing this super long study on cognitive control in different bilingual populations. So I was comparing untrained bilinguals, professional translators, and monolinguals. And I assumed that translators would have shown higher level of cognitive control during this 24 hours long task. So it was an extremely long task. Each participant had to come and stay in the lab for 24 hours, not during the same session, but over different sessions. Now, the participants totally proved me wrong, and I got the same pattern of results, of behavioral results for bilinguals and translators. Now, my hypothesis was that, the translators, because of professional practice, would behave differently, but I didn't got that pattern of superior cognitive control. They behaved exactly the same as the untrained bilinguals. So this was, one of those studies in which the participants proved me wrong and the experiment proved me wrong. So I would start from an hypothesis and then I had to change it because of the data that I obtained and that showed that at least for the type of task that I was using in that study, cognitive control might have been, due to everyday use of their two languages instead to professional practice. So, both groups would exhibit higher level of cognitive control, and that tells us that that higher level of cognitive control compared to monolingual speakers was just due to bilingualism, to the daily use of the two languages, not to professional practice. That was, I wasn't able to prove my hypothesis right. I wasn't able to accept my hypothesis, but the pattern of data that I got was interesting, sorry, anyways, because, I was able to make the argument about bilingualism overall in that case. Now, regarding how to stay open, humble, and curious, uh, honestly, I think that without these characteristics, it would be impossible to do research. I really think that researchers have to constantly question themselves, and that implies exactly the characteristics that you were mentioning. And, above all, I'll tell you, without curiosity, doing our job would be impossible. So the motor that really boosts our understanding of what we do and the reason why we do what we do is just curiosity. It's pure curiosity. I hope that answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, the being on the side that is often looking for research and like we love to conduct research as best as we can, but we don't always have the same access and the same ability to get together control groups and stuff. But on our side, a lot of the time we jump to, so something that I've noticed, we jump to, here's what we believe is the case, now let's prove it. So we need people that are open and humble and curious driving the actual research, and that's necessary. So I'm grateful for the work that you do, and I think also it's a challenge to those of us who are on maybe the business side or trying to craft solutions, doing design work, doing innovation work. We all like to fancy ourselves open and humble and curious, but also we are driving toward outcomes, and so remaining, it's a challenge to all of us on this side of the house trying to do cool things. Keep an open mind also as you go and rely on some of the research.
Einstein would say that, the output is not that important. What it's really important is understanding the problem. If you understand the problem well, That's your main point, and then the outcome will come by itself. But what we really need, above all in this society that goes so fast and it's so output centered, what we really need is to stop for a moment and try to get the best understanding of the problem that we can, and then the output will come. So that's a problem that, for example, I try to explain to my students. You really need that curiosity. Forget about the output. The output will be the consequence of your curiosity, but you really need that boost of curiosity because that will be what will trigger transformative research. It's curiosity, curiosity to explore things that have not been explored, that can help society, that can improve society and make people's life better. So that would be the main advice that, for example, I would give to my students. The starting point for whatever you do is curiosity, and then the outcome will just follow.
Absolutely. I love that. The other example that sometimes I point to, and like people use this all the time, but the whole concept of falling in love with the problem and not the solution also leaves you open to, if technology changes or circumstances change, makes you a little bit more impervious to that. And the example is Blockbuster and Netflix, because when they started, they looked very similar. Blockbuster, you rented a VHS or DVD in person, and Netflix, you did it online, but they still sent you a physical DVD in the mail. And the main difference when they look back at why Netflix was able to successfully transition to being totally streaming, the main difference is that Blockbuster focused on being a video rental company. That's what they were. And Netflix focused on, we provide the best at-home movie watching experience. So they focused on what the outcome was, what problem they were solving for, that people needed an easy way to have an at-home movie watching experience. And that made them more open. As different technology became available, it wasn't a threat to their mission. Instead, it was a bolster to their mission. They could use it, where Blockbuster saw it as a threat.
And that the key is that understanding the problem
Yeah.
From very different perspectives will give you flexibility when that time comes. So when the time to change comes. That's why it's so important in research. That's the only way to do useful research and to survive and keep doing what you're doing despite the sudden changes. So I'm thinking about AI, right? You need to be flexible, and the only way to be flexible is to have a thorough understanding of the problem. So
Absolutely.
the reasoning is
Great.
love it.
Thank you. Okay, our final question. How do you expect the conversation around language access to change in the next 10 years? And what's your hope for the next 10 years?
Okay, so I expect that language access will hopefully become a cornerstone of equity initiatives across industries. Now, of course, I'm sure that advances in AI and machine translation will enhance access, but to me, that access needs to be guided by human emotions, empathy, and compassion to ensure accessibility and emotional balance. And we already talked about this point.
Yeah.
So my hope for the future is that the conversation shifts from seeing language access as a service to recognizing it as a fundamental democratic right. There is a huge difference.
That is
And we need to fill that gap. Now, a world where no one is excluded from opportunities or vital information because of language as a barrier, that's the future that I want to help to build. And I believe that true equity cannot exist without linguistic inclusion, because language is what shapes who we are and how we connect and thrive. So in other words, my hope for the future is that language policymakers take the necessary steps to prioritize language access, Because by doing that, we're not just bridging gaps that we need to bridge, but we are literally empowering individuals to fully participate in society, no matter where they come from or what language they speak. So my hope, my sincere hope for the future is this more inclusive and human language policies.
So good. More human language policies. I love that.
Yeah, AI can be, of course, and machine translation. They're a tool. They're a very useful tool, but I think that you still need a human brain to make that work for us.
Agreed. And also, even as the technology evolves, you need the human to be centered. So the human making decisions about what the technology does, who it serves, what it does, like how it answers, that human being engaged in human-centered design absolutely matters. And the human receiving the interpretation service or translation service being centered in their experience being centered, ultimately that's what matters the most. So like you said, falling in love with the problem and not the means, and focusing on human welfare, human inclusion, human equity and access.
Human emotions. Exactly.
Emotions. Yeah, that's great.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Togato, we are up on time. This was so fun. I could talk to you forever.
Oh, me too, Francesca. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time
Your questions are so interesting. I really appreciate them. Thank you.
Okay. I really appreciate your research. Thank you for sharing with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
So fun. All right, we'll talk again soon. Thanks.
Of course. Thank you. Bye.